Well, hello everybody. A couple of things. Thank you to all the people who've sent me emails. I will be making a decision and sending out an announcement about the midterm later today or tomorrow, so keep tuned. Also, there was a student who came up after class last lecture and said that the syllabus has the readings listed in the wrong pages for the 10th edition. I went back and checked, and they are correct with my 10th edition. So is that student here? The only thing that I'm thinking is it's possible I have an instructor's version, and it might be that that one has different page numbers than the student version. I can't imagine they would be that stupid as a publisher, but if you see that there's different page numbers, email me. We need to figure out why. But my understanding is that the page numbers in the syllabus are the correct ones I want you to read. What? Oh, the international edition. Well, that's interesting. I don't know what the page numbers are in the international edition. What makes it international? The page numbers are different. That's what's different. Okay. Today we're going to talk about an extremely important topic, externalities. If any of you are going into environmental economics, that's an important topic, important field for research. This is probably the keystone of that area of economics. So far in this class, we have assumed or implicitly assumed that the firm that is producing a good bears the cost of producing it. All the cost that is used in producing the good, the firm pays for. And when a person consumes the good, that person who consumes the good gets the entire benefit of that consumption. And their willingness to pay represents that benefit. However, in reality, there can be situations in which this is not true. And so we want to today generalize our analysis to allow for these more these situations. In many situations, there are costs of production that the firm doesn't bear, and on the consumption side, there are benefits of consumption that the person who's buying the good and consuming it doesn't obtain, other people obtain. And these are called externalities. Whenever the private costs or benefits are not the same as the social costs or benefits, that is, the firm pays for some of the costs, but then other costs of the production are borne elsewhere by other members of society. Or when the consumer is obtaining benefits, but other people obtain benefits also from their consumption. So there's a social benefit. Then we have an externality. And they're kind of broken into two groups, and given the way I've been talking about it, it's clear. A negative externality is when there's a cost borne by society that's not borne by the firm that's producing the good. So the prime example of this is pollution. Many production processes produce pollution as a byproduct, either pollution in the air or some kind of in the water. And the firm generally does not have to pay for the costs of that pollution. Each of us pollutes when we drive. We put emissions into the air, and we don't have to pay individually for those costs when we're deciding whether to drive or not. We don't think about that we don't have to pay for the fact that we are increasing the chance of other people getting sick because of the pollution that we're creating, or that the whole nation's going to burn up from global warming. These are costs that are not borne by the person producing the good, but borne by society in general. Another example that's related to transportation that's important is driving in congested conditions. If you're trying to cross the Bay Bridge when it's congested, or any place that's got a congestion on the freeway, the individual person driving will consider how long it takes them to go. So if I decide to go across the Bay Bridge, I might worry that it's congested, so it might take me a long time. But I don't think about the fact that there are other people that are impacted by my being on the bridge. I add to the congestion by being there. That's an external cost that I don't bear myself, and yet is borne by other people and needs to be taken into the account in our analysis. What are other examples of negative externalities? Start thinking about these, you find them everywhere. In fact, if you think about things that irritate you, generally it's an externality. Well, yeah. Your roommate gaining weight because you have less space. That's true. I can find that irritating. Certainly on the bus it's hard when you're sitting next to someone that takes more than a seat. Yeah. Smoking cigarettes because the smoke affects other people. Secondhand smoke. Anything else? What? Noise from construction. I think noise is a big issue, yeah. Noise from construction, noise from motorcycles. Whoever's making the noise. I have a house down in Los Angeles, and I go down there on Friday, and it seems like every gardener in the country is blowing leaves and mowing on Fridays. And so, it's like my day off to have a nice time, and it's and none of them have to pay for my displeasure. Another pet peeve is elevators. When you go and someone hits the button to go from the second floor to the first floor, and the whole elevator of full people have to wait to open. That's an externality. The person who's saving time by not walking that one flight is incurring cost for everyone else that's in the elevator. Okay, so that's negative externalities. What's positive externalities? It's just the opposite of that. When the benefits of consumption are borne not entirely by the person who's consuming the good, but by other people as well. We have a great example of that here at Berkeley, mumps vaccine. If you get a mumps vaccine, that protects you, and so you get the benefit of it, but it also prevents you from getting sick and perhaps infecting other people, and so there's an external benefit to other people. So other people benefit from your getting a mumps vaccine. What's another example of a positive externality? What? Hug. Oh, that's so sweet. That's true. That's the the essence of it, and it probably helps everyone who's watching too. Everyone smiles. Education. If you get an education, you get value from it, but then you become a more productive member of the economy, and you produce benefits that you're not the only one who gets them. They spread out through the economy. So education is useful for everyone, yeah. Riding your bike instead of driving because there you're not polluting, yeah. Making music is, let's see, yes, those people who sit in BART and play music for us, everyone who goes by gets a benefit yes. So these are pervasive. They're, the more you look, the more you see them. And the basic problem here is that a standard competitive market, a free market as we normally allow, does not account for these and will in fact give the wrong amount of output for goods when there's externalities. So what we need to do is figure out what is the right amount in terms of pollution. What is the optimal amount of pollution? Does it mean no pollution? What does it mean? And then how do we attain that? What kind of interventions can we make in the market to move from what a free market would provide to one that is closer to what's socially optimal? So I'm going to use today an ongoing example, pollution from the production of fertilizer. So the fertilizer is used to make food. So I want to get across the point that there's always trade-offs. This is true. This is one principal idea in economics. There's always trade-offs. The benefit of creating food is obvious. We get people fed and less hunger as a result of that. But the creation of the fertilizer that's going into the production of the food as a byproduct creates pollution. Most forms of fertilizer do. And so we have this trade-off we have to deal with. There are two costs now. As soon as we start talking about externalities, we have to differentiate the costs that are borne by the private individual, the firm in this case, and the costs that are borne by the by society. And so I have marginal cost of production. This is the cost that the firm bears, each individual firm that makes fertilizer bears it, but it does not include the cost of pollution. And then there's the marginal cost of pollution, which is the cost of associated with the disease or disability that occurs because of bad air or bad water or whatever is being polluted. Importantly, this cost is the same as every other cost definitionally. It's the minimum cost of dealing with the pollution. So it might be the cost of preventing the pollution, it might be the cost of making a person who's sick, the medical cost to make them well again, but whichever one of those is cheapest is the marginal cost as we're using it here. Now, today I'm not going to talk about external benefits, but you should be, as you're going through this, kind of keeping in your mind how all of these things can just be shifted over and handle a positive externality. So that's something you're actually going to do explicitly in section, but it's a complete flip of what's going on today. The total cost to society then is the marginal cost to the firm that's producing the good and the marginal cost to society for the pollution that is obtained from that production. Notice also marginal cost, I should point out again, this is the extra cost for producing 1 extra unit of fertilizer. And so this is the extra cost of pollution for producing 1 extra unit of fertilizer. That's the extra pollution that results from 1 extra unit of fertilizer. So it's interesting in that the unit on the denominator, the extra unit, it's not an extra unit of pollution, it's an extra unit of output of the good, of the fertilizer. Then drawing them, I've drawn them now today in a very simple fashion because I want to get the ideas across. And then you can generalize this to any of the industries, any of the types of cost curves that we've dealt with. I'm going to say that marginal cost is flat for the firm. So it's a fixed marginal cost for the firms that produce this good. What happens here is what often happens with pollution is that if you only have a little bit of emissions from your production process, it just gets absorbed in the atmosphere and the water, and it doesn't really have a negative impact on anything. It's kind of part of the background that goes on anyway. But at some point, the emissions from the production process actually start incurring harm to individuals through sickness or to the lakes through the fish dying, and then we can't eat the fish or fish for them. It continues on up like this. As you get more and more pollution, more and more emissions, the cost of the pollution generally goes up at an increasing rate. Eventually it gets to where you could, it shoots up really like this. I mean, you can think about this in terms of global warming. There is going to get a point where the global warming's so bad the Earth fries and we're all dead. And so the cost is exceedingly high. But we're not there yet. And it goes up at kind of an increasing rate like that. So these things, that's pretty well the physical process. The difference between these two curves is the pollution cost. So at first, the marginal pollution cost is 0, and then it gets to be, at this point, the marginal pollution cost is that amount, and this is the total social cost. Now, what do we want to have from a social perspective, and what does a market bring us in this situation? We want to now look at the demand for fertilizer, which is a derived demand derived from the demand for food, because the producers of food need to have fertilizer to be able to make that process. So this is the willingness to pay for fertilizer, which is used to create food, and have a demand curve. It's pretty easy for you to guess now what the social optimal is. We want to have where the marginal willingness to pay for one last unit of the good is equal to the marginal social cost. We want to include all costs when we're making this judgment of what's good for society. And so this intersection of marginal social cost with the marginal willingness to pay is what's socially optimal. There's a few things to note there. Yeah. This time, I am assuming that this demand curve is the marginal social benefit. We're only looking at externalities on the cost side. You could also think that there's maybe externalities on the demand side, and in section you'll go through that and you can probably guess what it represents. But here I'm saying for food, each person who consumes the food, they get the benefit of it from the production of the food that's sold. Okay, the first thing to note is that the optimal social optimality does not involve no pollution. So the goal of preventing any pollution, having a pollution-free environment, is actually not best from a social perspective. Why? Because to do that, you would have to reduce production so much that we would lose the benefits of that production, and the benefits that we lose from the production outweigh the costs of the pollution. It's just like everything else, there's trade-offs on these things. If we were to go to the point where there's no pollution at all, or no pollution cost, we would have to move production back to this point here. And to do that, we would lose these benefits and would only gain these costs. Like here. So essentially, the value of the food is so great, it makes up for the cost of the pollution. We would rather have the cost of the pollution and be able to get the food than do without the food and not have the pollution. That's why I use food as an example. It's just as dire as pollution. You can either think of it as people die because of the pollution or they die because of lack of food. We want to do which has the least number of people dying, and that could be producing food even though it creates more pollution. That's the first thing to note, that it's probably exceedingly rare that the optimal outcome will be no pollution at all or no externality. Second thing is you can actually look on this graph and see what the total cost of pollution. Did you have a question? The cost of the pollution is this amount right here. You produce the fertilizer. Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay. I was thinking of this as being pollution that when you create the fertilizer, it creates pollution. What you're saying is that also when you use the fertilizer, it creates pollution too. Let's ignore that. Or you can say that that is incorporated into this marginal cost such that this is an extra unit produced and used, whichever way you want to look at it. A lot of fertilizer doesn't pollute, so, I mean, the use of it doesn't. The production does. But, okay, so what I was pointing out there is useful. This little odd-shaped triangle is the total cost to society of the pollution. It's the marginal cost of each unit summed up over all the units that are being produced. And so you have a measure of the total cost to society of the pollution, and as it shows here, it's not zero. Now, what would a freely operating competitive market do? Freely operating competitive market will end up with price equal to marginal cost, which means we would be at this outcome, which is a greater amount of output than is socially optimal. That's generally the result with a negative externality. A freely operating market is going to produce too much of the good because it doesn't take this cost into consideration. On the converse is for a positive externality, a freely operating market is going to produce too little of the good because it doesn't take the extra benefits into account. What are the losses to society of having the extra output that a freely operating market would attain? There are two losses. First, we're producing from here to here in a region where the social cost exceeds the benefit of the good, and so this right here, this triangle, becomes a loss to society because of cost exceeding the benefit of the good. This is like call that a deadweight loss if you want. This is for every extra unit that's produced, the pollution cost added to the private cost is more than people are willing to pay for the good. This is a case in which it's better not to produce more, even though doing so will allow you to have more food and more people live because of more food. It's that the extra cost of the pollution will outweigh that. So you don't want to go in that direction. So that's one loss. The other loss, though, is that notice that this is the marginal social cost using the marginal cost of pollution as I defined it, which is the minimum cost of dealing with the pollution. Sometimes that minimum cost is the cost of actually preventing the pollution. The minimum cost is the cost of dealing with the illness or whatever. But it's always the minimum cost. It's defined like every other cost that we've been using. In a freely operating market, there is no reason that the actual cost that's borne by society is going to be this minimum cost. For example, if the minimum cost of dealing with the pollution is actually to put on technologies that prevent the pollution, then a freely operating market, no firm will do that. A freely operating competitive market, each firm makes zero profit, and if it spent extra money to put on devices to prevent their own pollution, they would go out of business. So it's not just that the firms are not nice guys, nice folks. It's that the market makes it impossible for the firms to actually do what would be socially advantageous. Any firm that did put on the technology and incurred the cost of not polluting would essentially be run out of business. It would make zero negative profits. And so as a result of that, if the minimum cost is attained not by actually putting out the pollution and dealing with the illnesses from that, but rather putting in technology to prevent it, that minimum is not going to be attained. So that is in addition to this. That means that the true cost is not the minimum cost that I've written here. The cost that's borne given our production process is going to be higher than that. Yeah. Question was, what's this second problem? How can I repeat it? Who wants to tell him what the second problem is? The firm that is making the pollution, it might be cheapest for that firm to put in technology to prevent the pollution rather than allow the pollution and let the people get sick and then deal with the cost of the sickness. And yet that will never occur. Firms will never put in technology to reduce their pollution because if they did, they'd go out of business. Okay, so now what do we do with it? How do we then move from this point here, which has too much output, this dead weight loss, and not necessarily the minimum cost of dealing with pollution, back to this point? There are 4 different solutions that we have commonly used in the United States. I'm going to describe each of them. Each of them has advantages and disadvantages. There is no perfect solution here because the basic problem is you can't measure the marginal cost of pollution. It's exceedingly difficult. You can get some good guesses on it, but it's quite difficult. So that's basically the problem. And we have various tools that we can use to try to face that. Okay, the first solution, this is always the solution that would be ideal if you could implement it, is to internalize the externality. Essentially remove it as an externality and make the firm bear it. So if each firm had to pay the cost of pollution, the social cost of pollution that they produced, then they would take that into account in their own marginal cost calculations and take the social cost curve as their own cost curve, and a competitive market would end up at the social optimality. So essentially, if it's an externality, the first step you should try to do is there a way to internalize it, to make the firms bear it themselves? We have several laws that attempt to do this in specific situations. We have Clean Air and Clean Water Acts. Remember, did y'all see the settlement recently for the ship that ran into the Bay Bridge and leaked oil all over the bay? It was sued by the government, and it's responsible for the pollution that it created, and they came to an agreement on how much that would be paid. Did y'all see that in the paper? Yeah. It happens. This happens. Our government's involved in this every single day. I've been hired to for the Gulf oil spill, determine how much BP is supposed to pay for the loss to recreators because of the pollution on the beaches and in the Gulf. They're going to have to come up with a lot of money. This is an example of internalizing. This is where the firm themselves, the firms are responsible for the costs. Notice, however, that it can only really be applied meaningfully in a situation like a spill, where you can identify, okay, there's a firm that's responsible for this particular pollution. For air pollution coming out of cars, which of us is responsible for the marginal units? We're all doing it. We're not, and a firm that's creating pollution in the air, it combines with the pollution that's already there, and some people get sick and other people don't get sick. Who's going to say that this person was sick because of this firm and that person was sick because of that firm? It's exceedingly difficult in many situations to actually internalize the cost of the externality, the cost of the pollution. And so then we need another solution. So internalize it is always the first solution if you can do it. Tax on fertilizer. A way that will attain social optimality if the government has correct information is to put a tax. You can always attain social optimality with a tax, and this is an extremely useful and interesting point. It takes a piece of information that is not readily available, but if you assume it's available or can make some good guesses at it, then you can get very close to optimality on this. Essentially, what we want is to move from this intersection, marginal cost, intersecting demand, which is what the market would have originally, to this intersection. And we already know the impact of a tax. If we taxed a certain amount of excise tax on fertilizer equal to amount T, then the marginal cost curve of the firm is going to go up by that amount of tax. Essentially, the tax simply becomes another cost that the firm has to pay, and takes that into consideration. So that will bring us to a new equilibrium that happens to be at the intersection of marginal social cost with demand. Notice that the key to this, though, is knowing what size tax to place. You can obviously place a tax that the size that I've given makes it move exactly the right place. If you put too high of a tax, you're going to produce too little. You put too low of a tax, you're going to produce too much. So you've got to get the right amount of tax. And the correct tax is the marginal cost of the pollution, that is the marginal externality cost associated with the optimal amount of production. So if you know what is the if you know this whole social marginal cost curve, you can calculate what is the optimal amount of output, and then calculate the marginal social cost at that amount and put on the tax. This is the reason this is one of the justifications for gas taxes. A gas tax moves the price of gas closer to the social cost of gas, including the fact that burning gas creates externalities. Notice what is happening here. When we've talked about taxes before, I've shown how taxes in all previous cases actually reduce social welfare, move us away from what's socially optimal. This is a tax that moves us towards what's socially optimal. So in the presence of externalities, a tax can actually be beneficial in terms of the market, not just in generating revenue for the government, but in terms of the optimality of the market. It moves us towards what's socially relevant. And not only that, this revenue that the government gets is in excess of the cost of the pollution, so the government can pay for the cost of the pollution and have money left over, which allows the government to reduce other taxes, which moves us closer to social optimality in those markets that were previously taxed. So it has a double gain. It moves us towards social optimality in this market, and it allows other taxes to be reduced, which moves us towards social optimality there. So again, the best tax policy you can think of, if you're just thinking of tax policy from the beginning, is to first enumerate all the goods that have negative externalities and tax them. Tax them an amount that brings towards social optimality. And then if you need more revenue, then you start doing something else. But that would be using taxation in a way that actually moves us towards social optimality instead of away from it. Now, the issue of how much to tax is actually difficult, as you can guess, and a little bit can be counterintuitive or confusing. The problem generally is if we're at this point here, where and we're deciding how much tax to put, and if we measure the marginal cost of pollution, the marginal pollution cost of an extra unit of fertilizer at our given level of output, we can measure on the margin what an extra unit of output is going to cost in terms of extra pollution. We will come up with this amount here. So if we are currently in a situation of a freely operating market, no taxes, nothing yet, and we're trying to figure out what to do to tax, and we want to measure what's the marginal cost of pollution, our result would be, if we measure it correctly, would be this amount right here. If we then add that tax, we're going to be adding too large of a tax. And this tax here that I've just described, that's based on the marginal cost at our current level of output, is going to move us to too low a level of output. And as I've drawn it, we're now going to have this loss relative to what's optimal traded off against this loss. It could be that that's actually bigger than this. I don't know how it works drawing, but you could actually move to a worse situation by putting too large of a tax if you're not careful about measuring marginal social cost at the right point. Okay? So the issue here is you want to put the marginal social cost at the optimal amount of output, which is not generally the output level that you're at. If you were at optimal, you wouldn't be worrying about it. Okay? However, so this makes it difficult. This means that when the analysis is being done, you don't want to just measure at your current point, but try to get this whole curve. The government spends a lot of money. There is amazing amounts of money spent doing research trying to measure these things. And they're all imprecise, as you can guess, but my belief is it's better to at least get some idea of it and try to deal with it than not anything at all. Yeah. Who? Oh, the Hugs guy. The question is, because the tax will probably be passed on to consumers, will that affect things? The answer is it's already incorporated. Essentially, the tax is, in this market here, it's a perfectly competitive market. The tax will be entirely passed on to consumers because producers are making zero profit. They don't have any money to pay. But the loss to consumers, let's go back to this previous one. Consumers will lose this amount of benefit themselves from not being able to consume the good because of having the higher price. And that is a loss, but that's more than made up for with the gain of not having this much extra pollution. So that is incorporated into the graph, that the consumers are paying the higher price and they're reducing their consumption because of that, and they're losing benefits from the reduced consumption. All of that is incorporated. Good point. Okay, remember I had talking about regulation of natural monopoly, how I think it's very important for the regulators to be adjusting as time goes by, seeing how things are changing. The market might not be a natural monopoly anymore. There's a tendency for our political process to be against change. It kind of is like admitting you made a mistake and so something's the matter with you. I think we should embrace making mistakes and learning from them. So regulators of natural monopolies keep having to look at what's going on, make changes as it goes along. The same thing happening here. You could easily see a situation where the best you can do is measure here, put on the tax, that'll put you here, you do a remeasurement, you find out that now our marginal cost of pollution is a lot lower than the tax that we're applying, and so let's lower the tax. You can, by this process, move towards optimality. So I don't think the fact that measurement of the whole curve is a difficult thing to do should prevent the activity of trying to use taxes in this way. And we do use taxes in this way. Actually, I think we don't use them enough in this fashion to deal with externalities. So this could be a great solution. This is another reason for taxing cigarettes. That's okay. Now, there are other ways that we have pursued for dealing with pollution. One of them is to place mandatory restrictions on the amount of pollution that can be produced per unit of output. So factories that produce a certain amount of certain goods are told that for every unit of output you can only pollute a certain amount. For cars, it comes into our emission standards on cars. You probably don't know this. You always get the miles per gallon on your car, and there are laws that we're going to talk about them in a second, change the miles per gallon or place limits on what miles per gallon can be on a car. But there's also limits on the emissions. We have very strict emissions. How many of y'all watched Mythbusters the other day? They showed that motorcycles actually pollute more than cars do, even though they use tremendously less gas. Which motorcycle? I don't know. Look up the Mythbusters. But the reason is cars have very strict restrictions on emissions per unit of gasoline burned, and motorcycles don't. So that's how you get that seeming paradox. The advantage of this is that it reduces pollution for any level of output. It also, by raising the cost of the good, reduces output. So both of these things are moving us towards the direction that we'd want to go. We have less pollution and less output. This one is less pollution per unit of output, and then we also reduce the amount of output, so it's kind of a double whammy. The difficulty, of course, is carriage returns don't seem to work too well here. You got to know the optimal amount of pollution per unit of output. And if we could figure that out, we might as well put a tax, and it would be a much easier procedure to use. Also, it is not necessarily the minimum cost way of dealing with things. For example, it could be, you think of two cars, say a Cadillac and a Toyota. I don't know if this is true because I don't know the technology of them. But it could be exceedingly inexpensive to reduce the emissions per gallon on a Cadillac, and yet very expensive to do so on a Toyota. It could be. There's no reason for both of them to reduce by the same amount. The one that finds it less expensive to do so should be reducing more. On the margin, the cost of their reducing pollution should be the same. And a standard like this does not take that into account. It says everyone has to reduce their pollution per unit to a certain level, independent of how much it costs you to do that. But as always we've discovered in this class, there are trade-offs. There's costs versus benefits. And you want the cheapest ways of reducing pollution to be implemented first, and then the more expensive ones and more expensive. So you don't always have everyone at the same level of pollution afterwards. It has to be a trade-off with the cost. And this procedure doesn't do that. This is called command and control, and it's kind of out of style these days because it doesn't take these differences in costs into consideration, and it's not a market-based solution like a tax would be. Another procedure that we've used, which tries to incorporate this last issue, is tradable permits. Firms are given permits for pollution that tell them you can put out so many tons of emissions per year in your plant. The government at one point in time decides how much total amount of pollution is allowed and divvies up that total amount among the permits given to each firm. Usually this is done based on an historical analysis of what has been done in the past, and then over time the permits are ratcheted down such that each firm has to reduce their pollution over time. So if the permits were simply a mandate on how much you can pollute, then it would be essentially the same as the previous procedure. A firm that had a very high cost of reducing their pollution would have to bear that high cost and reduce it, just the same as a firm that had a low cost a firm with a low cost would just reduce the amount they need to and no more, even though their cost of going even further would be low. So if these permits were just issued and that was it, then it wouldn't be any different than the previous concept. However, what we do is allow the firms to buy and sell these. So a firm that has a high cost of reducing their pollution can buy permits from other firms, and firms that have a low cost of reducing their pollution can reduce their pollution more than they would have just by their permits and sell their permits to other people. Essentially, what happens is you have a market for pollution, and a competitive market for pollution will end up just like anything else at the socially optimal point. This is, in a sense, a way of internalizing. This is a way of internalizing the cost of pollution, because each firm essentially makes money by reducing their pollution and selling their permits, or reducing their pollution and not having to buy as many permits. So they're always making a trade-off between the cost of reducing pollution versus how much the permits are worth. And what happens in this, in a freely operating market, is that the marginal cost of reducing pollution eventually moves to the price, or stating it correctly, the price of the permits ends up moving towards the marginal cost of reducing pollution by 1 unit. This is an extremely good procedure. The only difficulty with it is that the government has to know the total amount of permits to issue at a particular time, which is essentially the same as knowing what the total amount of output should be, or what the social optimality is. And that's a relatively difficult thing to know. But just like with the tax, I think it's fine for us to try something, revise our ideas, not think that just because we did it wrong we're stupid, but learn from the mistakes and move on to another one. So I think this is a quite good approach. In the industries in which this has been tried, so far the trading of permits has been fairly sparse. Most firms hang on to their permits even if they don't need them, because I think they fear at the end of the year they're not going to be able to produce if they don't have their permits. And so the markets haven't been working very well. But this is just another example, I think, just like with electricity earlier. When you set up a new market, it takes a while for people to learn how to work it and how things are supposed to operate. And so I don't think that means we should avoid this procedure. We just need to go further and let it go further on. Okay, so these are the solutions. Any questions on this before we move on? No. One thing I want to point out here that I think is interesting, a continuing theme in this course is that firms operate in their own interest, consumers operate in their own interest, and there's no use thinking of that as being good or bad. It just is. Competitive firms are not better than monopolists, even though a competitive outcome is better than a monopolist outcome. They're all simply trying to maximize their profit, ignoring everybody else. It's just that the structure of the market is such that in a competitive situation, it ends up, all that selfishness somehow transforms into what's socially optimal. And for a monopoly, that doesn't happen. So the motives are the same. And whenever you look at motives, you're not going to be able to analyze very well what's happening. You want to look at how the system uses incentives to move to a certain point. And a great example of this is a polluting monopolist. What could be worse than a monopolist that pollutes? And yet, if you take this monopolist and try to put a tax on it to deal with the pollution, you're going to make the matter even worse. Essentially, this is a case where, in fact, two wrongs kind of make a right. What is socially optimal here? Where marginal social cost is equal to demand. What's the competitive output here? But what is a monopolist going to do? Monopolist isn't going to set price equal marginal cost, it's going to set marginal revenue equal marginal cost. So it's going to produce here, which is less than the socially optimal output level. So actually, a competitive industry is going to produce too much in this situation, A monopolist is going to produce too little in this situation. And actually the harm from the monopolist is this amount, which is considerably less than the harm from a competitive industry. So in this case, a polluting monopolist is better than a polluting competitive industry. Not quite so bad. And if we've tried to now tax this firm to deal with the pollution, we're simply going to make the matter worse. If we tax the firm by the marginal cost of pollution at its level of output, what's going to happen? We're going to move its marginal cost curve up to this. The firm's going to reduce its output even further and move further from social optimality. The point here is you don't look at things being good or bad because of their motives. You look at how all of it plays together in terms of the incentives, where the market would go without intervention, what's socially optimal, and then how to move there. In this case, what we actually would want to do is not tax the firm, but subsidize it to move it to this point. We would want to move its marginal cost down to here so it would produce what's socially optimal. Isn't that strange? We want to hand money over to a polluting monopolist. But that is what's socially optimal. So this is a kind of a pep talk, but this is a continuing theme. It really does, it's kind of like when you deal with your friends. Dealing with motives really doesn't help you a lot. Just try to figure out what works out for everyone. Thank you.